Good afternoon, everybody. So you may recall on Thursday, we were chatting about the four big economic issues that macroeconomics discusses. Remember, long-term economic growth, short-term business fluctuations, employment and unemployment, and inflation. And we talked about how economic activity was measured by real GDP, or real gross domestic product. So today we want to spend our time thinking about how we actually measure those variables, GDP, unemployment, inflation. We're also going to talk a little bit about interest rates, because it turns out that in a capitalist economy, interest rates are one of the most important prices that we can look at. It's because interest rates are essentially the price of borrowing or lending money. So as financial capital gets reallocated around the economy, it's real interest rates that will determine what that price is. So that's what we want to try and do today. So let's think, though. We'll start with measuring economic activity. As we said, economic activity is going to be measured by gross domestic product. And it turns out that a long time ago, in the 1930s and early 1940s, an accounting mechanism or framework was developed in which to look at how much the economy produces. And that accounting framework is known as the National Income and Product Accounts. Every country uses this essential framework. Some of the details are different, but everybody uses this basic structure. So what we're going to say here today about how we do it in the United States is broadly reflective of how it's done elsewhere in the world. Some people, or some governments, of course, can measure things more accurately or more quickly than can other governments, and that does make a difference, but the actual framework itself is exactly the same. Now, it turns out that the National Income and Product Account recognizes that there are actually three different ways in which we can measure economic activity. And conceptually, they should give us exactly the same answer. Those three ways are known as the product approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach. The product approach looks directly at production, how much is being produced. The expenditure approach says how much is being bought, with the recognition that everything that gets produced in some time period must also be owned by somebody during that time period. That is, it has to be bought. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute, how about a business that produces something but doesn't sell it? Well, guess what? They just ended up buying it from themselves. Right? So we need to account for that factor as well. And in the third approach, the income approach, recognizes that in order to produce something, you need to pay the workers, pay the vendors who are supplying all the other inputs, and anything that's then left over becomes the profits of the business owners or the entrepreneurs. So the value of production should also equal the value of expenditures, which will also equal the value of income generated. So that's the beauty of the National Income and Product approach. It gives us three different ways of measuring exactly the same thing. As I mentioned, conceptually, we should get exactly the same answer. Now, in an economy as large and as complicated as the United States, when we measure these things from three different ways, we don't actually get exactly the same answer. But it's reasonably close. And when I mean reasonably close, we might be off by 50 to 75 to $100 billion. Now, that sounds like a big miss, right? I'm sure we all want our share of that $100 billion. But we have to remember that the economy is $16 trillion. So a little error of 50 to $100 billion in percentage terms is actually fairly small. Now, this leads us then to the idea that total production of the economy is also equal to total expenditures and total income. So notice then, when we talk about production, we're also talking about expenditures, and we're also talking about income. So we can, and we do, use these terms interchangeably, mostly to confuse people who have never heard this lecture. Right? So when you go talk to your friends who are haven't taken macroeconomics, and you start talking about production, they'll be shaking their heads up and down, and then you can start talking about income or expenditures. You mean exactly the same thing. They'll be totally confused. Right? That's what experts are all about, right? We have our own language that only we understand. So let's think about the product approach first. How would we measure production in the economy? Now let's remember that there are literally millions and millions of different types of goods and services that are produced in the economy. What we have to figure out is how can we add them all up? Right? How do we add all of those up? So when we think about the production side, what we're going to look at is the current market value of all final goods and services newly produced in the domestic economy during a specified period of time. Okay? Now, let's unpack that a little bit, because there are a couple of key words that we need to think about. Market value, final, newly produced, domestic economy, and the period of time. Market value is simply telling us what is the value of a product when it is sold. Right? It's price times quantity. Right? So we can't add up all the Apple laptop computers with Nike tennis shoes, with General Motors automobiles, with UC Berkeley lectures. Right? We can't just add all of those up. We have to have some way of combining them together. And the way in which we combine them together is to turn them into price terms. How much money was spent on Apple computers, in Nike tennis shoes, in Berkeley tuition, in General Motors automobiles? Once we have it in dollar terms, we can add up all the dollars. Right? And now we've got a measure of the value of what that production was. So current market value is simply looking at the current prices of all the goods and services that are being produced. Now, there are a couple of things that we need to be aware of. Not everything that is of value is actually sold in the marketplace. These are what we call non-market goods and services. And because some of these are very important, we need to have a way of trying to figure out what their value actually is. So let me give you an example. Think about fire protection or police protection. We don't actually pay a direct price for that. Right? I don't get a bill that says, okay, you got 365 days worth of fire protection last year at X number of dollars per day, therefore the market value was this. That's not how we value most government services that are being provided. Rather, we value those through the taxes that we pay. Okay? So the way that we would impute a value for police protection, fire protection, education, parks and recreation, things that are provided by general taxes through the government, is to look at what does it cost to actually provide those goods and services. How much does it cost? So we've imputed a value. There are several other things that are important in terms of imputed values too, but the government example will give you an idea of how we go about doing that. Now, it turns out that while some non-market goods and services do get included, most do not get included. And the reason is, it's sometimes really hard to figure out what the price should be. Right? We might be able to measure the quantity, but we can't see what the price should be. So as an example, suppose you are a volunteer tutor at one of the public schools, right? Helping young children learn math or econ or their letters or their numbers or their colors, whatever it might be. Right? There's obviously value there. Something is being produced. You're providing tutoring services. But because you're a volunteer, you're not being paid. We don't know what price to put on that. Right? Volunteer at a hospital, same thing. We don't know what price to put on that. We're not saying it doesn't have value. We're not saying that there isn't production there. All we're saying is we don't know how to value that. Or think about this. You clean your own room, maybe, or maybe not as frequently as you should. You might do your own laundry. You might do your own shopping and cooking. Right? None of those things actually get counted in GDP. You can't put a price on it. Now, suppose that instead you go out and you hire a company to come in and clean your apartment, do your laundry, do your shopping, do your cooking and your meals. Magically, GDP just went up. Because that's output that we can measure, and we can see what the price is. We've taken a non-market activity and converted it to a market activity. So we can now include it. The point of this discussion is GDP is our best measure of economic output. It's not a perfect measure of economic output. Right? We can only measure what we can measure. And if there are no prices, it's really hard to find out what the market value is. A third thing, there are some market goods and services that are not included. Mostly, these are illegal activities, or activities that take place underneath what we call underneath the table or in the black market, where nobody wants the government to know about it, either because it is illegal or B, because they don't want to pay taxes on the income that's being earned. Okay. Now, governments do attempt to measure some of these things. So, starting next month, for the fourth quarter of 2014, the European nations are going to start making an estimate and including it in GDP of illegal activities. Illegal drugs, prostitution, and a variety of other things that are currently illegal. How they're actually going to do that, I'm not so sure. And how good that measurement is, I'm not so sure. But every one of those European economies is going to be bigger once they include this than what we thought before. The growth rate may not be any faster, but the size of the economies will be bigger. Okay? So again, market value is important. We've got the price. We can attach it to the quantities, but we have to be careful about what prices we're actually looking at. But that gives us our market value. The next thing we need to do is look at final goods and services. Now, this may have been one of those topics that confused you when you were taking Econ 1, the difference between a final good and an intermediate good. The easiest way to think about it is intermediate goods are the inputs to the production process. Final goods is what's ultimately going to be sold as a final or usable product. It will not go into the production process of any other goods or services. Okay? So final goods, the production process is complete. Intermediate goods, the production process is incomplete. It will continue to go through the production process where more and more value added will be included.
Are intermediate goods that go into markets that aren't counted for GDP called final goods?
No, they're still called intermediate goods. Okay. Yes?
Does it matter how those get sold, like, for example, with microchips in the computer where you put these for wholesale?
Nope. So the question was, does it matter how they're being sold? So take microchips, right? Microchips go into computers. So if you sell microchips to Apple to put into their computers, microchips are an intermediate good. If you sell your microchips to a wholesaler, who presumably is then going to sell them to Apple or maybe HP or anybody else, it's still an intermediate good. Okay, so that's really the distinction. Intermediate goods kind of disappear along the way of the production process, but final goods are there. That's what gets sold to the ultimate user of the product. No further production is going to take place on that good or that service. Now, having said that, there are two exceptions, or two caveats. The first is for what we call capital goods. The second is for what we call inventory investment. Let me talk about capital goods first. Capital goods are physical assets that are used in the production process, but they are not completely used up. In fact, they must have, by definition, a usable lifespan of 3 years or longer. We count those as final goods because even though a portion of them is used up, but it's not completely used up in the production process. Let me give you an example. Suppose you have you own a pizza parlor, and you make deliveries. You must be near a college campus. So you need a new delivery van, right? So you go out and you buy a brand new delivery van that say costs $20,000. Right? So that $20,000 delivery van had to be built that year. In GDP, we count all 20,000 of that as a final product, even though in the course of that year you're going to maybe making deliveries with it, and you're going to wear some of that delivery van out. So if that delivery van has a usable life of, say, 10 years, that means you've used up or depreciated your van by $2,000. So $2,000 is actually an intermediate good. The other, all 20, though, we count as the final good. The reason we count all of it as a final good, remember, it's called gross domestic product. Gross means before depreciation. So we've got the whole $20,000. We don't have to worry about the $2,000 we're using up. That's depreciation. We're going to count the entire $20,000 in this year's GDP, or the year in which the product was produced. Okay? Now, inventory investments. Remember, what we're trying to measure here is production that takes place in the economy. So we have to recognize that in a production process, we might not complete the entire process by the end of the time period that we're looking at. Right? So if you're building cars, you might have a half-built car, or a quarter-built car, or a three-quarters-built car, or some combination of all of that. We know that those are actually intermediate goods. Right? They're not final for sure. They're still going to be an input into the rest of the production process to come out as a final good ultimately. But even though they're an intermediate good, for the time period that we're looking at, we must count it as a final good. Now, one thing about inventory investment. Inventory investment can be positive if inventories are rising. Inventory investment can also be negative if inventories are falling. I'll come back to that when we talk about the expenditure approach, which maybe will make it a little clearer. Okay? So these two things then are exceptions to our rule about final goods and services, capital goods and inventory investment. We are also only going to include newly produced goods. Remember, we're trying to get a handle on the amount of production that takes place during a specific time period. So we only want to look at that time period in things that are produced that period. So all of a sudden you realize summer's here. Actually, summer's gone, but let's suppose we fast forward. Summer's here. You've got a nice part-time job, but what you need is a set of wheels to get back and forth from wherever you're living to wherever you're working, right? So you need to go out and get a car. But is it a part-time job? You really can't afford to get a brand new car, so you go out and you buy, 2003 Honda Civic, right? We're not going to count that Honda Civic in 2014 GDP. It was built way back in 2003. We want to count it when it's built, not when it's bought. Okay? When it's built, not when it's bought. Now, if you've now graduated, you've got this big new fancy job, great title, big paycheck, they're going to pay you a signing bonus, and you want your brand new 2015 BMW 5 Series, and you go out and you buy it, guess what? They got to build it. So that would be included in 2014 GDP. We only want to count the things that are built in the year that we're paying attention to. That does not mean that the buying and selling of used goods shows up absolutely nowhere in the GDP accounts. Let's suppose, for instance, that you're going to buy a house. And when you buy a house, this house was built 10 years ago. So the purchase price of the house itself does not get included in GDP. But in that process of buying the house, you have to pay certain people, right? The real estate agent is providing you with real estate services in the current time period. So there, the compensation of the real estate agent would be counted in current year's GDP. But the big increase in, or the big purchase price of the value of the house itself would not. Yes? Aha, I was just going to talk about that. Nice segue. So the question was, what happens if the price of the house increases? So let's suppose you bought the house for $1 million, and now a number of years later, you can sell it for $2 million. How much production took place between the million and $2 million? No, the value went up. How much production of houses took place? 0. Capital gains changes, or capital losses, do not directly affect GDP. Okay, so changes in prices alone of existing goods would have no effect on nominal GDP. By the way, that also means that purely financial transactions, buying and selling stocks, bonds, foreign exchange, all that kind of stuff, does not show up in GDP, except to the extent that you have to pay somebody to execute that transaction. So I happen to have my stock accounts at Schwab. When I buy and sell things, the only part that shows up in GDP is how much Schwab charges me for that transaction. Doesn't make any difference whether I made money or more likely lost money on that transaction, but the only thing that shows up is what I pay Schwab. Okay? Now, it's also in the domestic economy. This is the D in gross domestic product, or GDP. Right? This is this D right here. We're looking at the geographic boundaries of the country. What is being produced within the geographic boundaries of the United States? That's it, right? Now, we also want to look at this over a specified period of time. Specified period of time. Production is a flow, what we call a flow variable. Right? We produce so many units per year, or per month, or per whatever. Right? It's what we call a flow. Production is a flow. So GDP is a flow variable. That's in distinction to a stock variable, which measures something at a particular point in time. We will see lots of stocks and flows as we go through the class. For those of you who have had accounting, a flow is an income statement. A stock is a balance sheet item. Right? You measure it at a point in time. Okay, now let's think about the expenditure approach. So expenditures is total spending on final goods and services, actually newly produced, within a domestic economy during a specified period of time. So notice everything except the very first line is exactly the same. Rather than the market value, this is just how much we're spending. Now also remember that last week I said we only have in macroeconomics 4 economic agents. Households, or consumers, businesses, producers, governments, aggregated together, and foreigners that we interact with. Again, all aggregated together. So we can talk about the kind of expenditures that take place with each of those economic agents. So with households or consumers, we call it consumption. With businesses or producers, we call it investment. With governments, we call it government purchases. And with foreigners, we call it net exports. Whoops. Okay, so C, I, G, and NX. This leads to something known as the national income identity, or the income expenditure identity. So this right-hand side of this equation, or identity, is our expenditures, right? Consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. And as we'll see in just a little bit, Y is the symbol we use for income. That's because I is already being used for investment. Okay? So we use Y. Okay? This is the single most important identity in macroeconomics. Almost everything that we do will flow from this or one other equation that we have. So this will turn out to be an incredibly important identity. And notice it's just that. It's an identity. It comes from the national income and product accounts that tells us that total production equals total expenditures equals total income. Here we're just saying income equals expenditures. Now, if we look at each of these 4 categories in a bit more detail, what we would see is that consumption is the spending by domestic households on final goods and services. And we actually break that into 3 categories: durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. The distinction is as follows. A durable good is something that has a useful lifetime of 3 years or longer. So this would include cars and trucks, appliances, furniture, carpeting, books, computers, right? All that kind of stuff would be considered to be durable goods. Non-durable goods are physical items that have a lifetime, expected lifetime, of 3 years or less. Food, clothing, gasoline, magazines, newspapers.